Eric, thank you. Thank you for a warm intro and handoff. Let me dive straight into it. And I'll talk to you about why public database as a service is prime for open source disruption. But you guys have guessed that yeah, already. All right. And three things I want you to take away from this talk is A, what the database as a service has won as a way to consume the databases. That really because it offers unparalleled convenience of using the database. And let's face it, we are all suckers for convenience. The second thing is what software vendor lock-in sucks and should be avoided if you can. And third is what, as usually, there is an open source to come to the rescue. But let me take you a bit to the early days of modern open source. And I'm not sure about you, but I got involved with open source in late 90s. And at that time, the open source had a lot more rough corners than it is now. And I remember how installation working with open source was at that time. You had to download the sources, probably find some patch to make it work with your particular compiler or Linux version, right? Then compile it. Hopefully you have all the binaries and headers and whatever you need to compile it ready and so on and so forth. That took some time, skill, and effort. When we had a good progress in simplicity, we got targz binaries and the install script, which made it easier. Then we from that moved on to packages, which would track dependencies, then to repositories, which will install all the dependencies for you, all the way to those new ways of Docker and Snap, which provide you a self-contained application, right? Where you don't even have to think about what you have to do if you have two different packages which need the same file, but they need it in a different version, right? And stuff like that. As you can see from this trend is what we are moving forwards, making things easier and easier in open source and reducing barrier to entry. To the point that if you look at the modern open source now, what most developers will not be able to build from scratch all the tools they use, right? I don't think many of you working with Linux, for example, build the Linux distribution from scratch in a long time. And I would say even the open source databases those days, installing them on Linux use some of the provided binaries instead of building them on their own. And I think that is great because that really allows us to use more complicated and more valuable software. And that allows us to get more people to be involved with open source, being open source developers, or at least the users of the open source. With that, though, comes the dark side, at least for open source, that is. And this is what if the next round of a simplification typically goes with deploying this open source software in the cloud, which comes with a vendor lock-in in the cloud, right? So that is your current state. If you're looking at the open source databases, in particular, you want to deploy them in the fastest and most convenient way possible, you have to do it in the cloud using proprietary API, right? Now, of course, there is an other choice to deploy the database in the cloud. You can build your own database platform using the building blocks of the cloud provides, such as compute, storage, and so on and so forth, right? But that will not be as simple and convenience as you get if you use database as a service. Database as a service indeed provide a lot of value, especially for the teams which don't have skilled and dedicated DBA, as many folks, many teams are at this point in time, right? They can help you to manage and have ability, database patch and backups, security. They provide some easy ways to scalability by scaling instance size, and so on and so forth. One thing what that gives is a more power to developers to build the better apps faster. Because as developer, you don't no more need DBA help, or in many cases even permission to deploy the database, right? You can just speak the database you like, deploy it, charge it on your credit card, and your manager may not even discover that. And then by the time he does, it will be too late. The application will be already shipped and maybe even in production. And you can rely a lot on the cloud vendor to keep it up and running. And you should not worry. The database as a service and the cloud vendor are open source compatible, at least in a concept of Hotel California defined compatibility. And what I mean by that is they make it very easy for you to move in, but typically it's a lot harder to go back to the open source because you are going to be relying on some additional features which only those uh, uh, technologies provide. Another thing which we see, especially recently along many of our customers and community members, is what fully managed database as a service tend to be over marketed, right? Same as a burger displayed here, it does provide some value and it can satisfy your hunger, but it's not nearly as fully managed as it may look. You still often need somebody to understand the databases, for example, to decide on a schema, help with some queries, design sane security practices, and stuff like that. What we also found is what in database as a service world, there is increased number of incidents, being that security, downtime, excessive expenses, because developers choose to use those databases without working with database professionals, right? And well, that comes with consequences. Let me share some database as a service stats with you. As I mentioned, the database as a service has won, and it's actually continues to grow. Right now, according to Percona survey, not everybody runs a database as a service yet, but that number is continues to grow, right? The significant number of folks, which is actually high among the folks who run a database as a service, find the cloud hosting to be more expensive than they thought. And the large number of people still concerned with performance and availability problems wherever you run database as a service environment or you don't. Another interesting thing with database as a service is what you can see what a premium which you charge for a privilege of running that database as a service software versus just infrastructure in the cloud is growing. And as you can see from this trend, which changed from relatively modest 30% to paying essentially as much for the software as you pay for the infrastructure, right? Which ends up to thousands of dollars every year for instance of a decent size. And maybe that is not quite Oracle prices, maybe at least not yet, right? You may see for your infrastructure size, what the database vendor login is not as painful now. But believe me, it's going to be more painful in the future as cloud evolves and also as your infrastructure grows. And there is a history lesson I can use to illustrate that, right? If you see that guy on the left, that is young Larry Ellison. He didn't have that large of a boat at that time. And actually, what he was doing is he was saving the customers from big, nasty, big blue, IBM, which really had horrendous hardware locking with their mainframe computers and the DB2 database, right? Well, folks have been saved, but how many of you running Oracle feel saved from a vendor lock-in right now, right? As the time goes and companies tend to acquire more dominance, they have a more of a flexibility to exercise the lock-in, of course. So with all of that, the question you should be asking, can we get that public cloud database as a service like simplicity, but as open source solution? Wouldn't be that be great? And I have unfortunately bad news for you. We are not there yet, but we are going there. I think in this regard, where Kubernetes is truly fantastic and transformational technology, which empowers a lot of this change. Kubernetes is essentially the operating system, but for clusters rather than individual hosts. It has a lot of momentum and community support, and to the point what it is universally supported in public, private, and a hybrid cloud. Many companies who used to have their own solutions, right, are either embracing Kubernetes entirely or at least adding that as a support. Think about Amazon with its container storage, right? Or Mesosphere with messes, or VMware recently going full on with Kubernetes, right? So that is a foundation which allows us now to build the open source based database as a service solution, which actually can run across a variety of a cloud much easier than supporting each and every cloud directly. The next question you should ask, well, Pirkona, that is a fantastic problem statement, but what are you folks doing about that? Well, at this point, we have released the operators for the Kubernetes for MySQL and MongoDB, and also we've been working now for years on Percona monitoring and management to be the open source solution to simplify monitoring and in the future managing databases in and out of the cloud. We have now our Kubernetes operator available on the operator hub, for example, and we are really looking towards having the Percona operators available on a variety of on the platform in the near future. One thing you note, though, is what the Kubernetes operators, right, even if they're deploying on the OpenShift, they are not enough. They don't provide quite the same level of convenience as I can get with Amazon RDS, where I can deploy the data with a couple of clicks of a single API calls. And of course, you are right. With that, our vision is to make sure what we provide Amazon RDS-like experience in public and private cloud with open source software, and as such, with no software vendor lock-in. And that is what we see as one of the functions of what we call Percona enterprise platform. Now, don't be mistaken by this word enterprise, right, in the name. While many other companies which use open core model call the enterprise the proprietary software, their community software is open source. Picona Enterprise Platform is open source while offering you advantages comparable to what would be Enterprise Edition, proprietary Enterprise Edition you would see from other vendors. We're not quite there yet. We are working on the Better for Enterprise platform, which is launching later this year. And I would very much encourage you to participate, to sign up for a Better program. So then we are ready. We will talk to you and your experience evaluation and so on and so forth. And of course, addition to that, we'll have the source of this available as well. So if you can choose to play it this way, you can do it as well. So let me leave with what I have started. As I mentioned, the database as a service have won because of the unparalleled convenience of using a database it has. Software vendor lock-in sucks, and the open source is coming to the rescue, and we are at Percona working well to be part of that open source movement, and we hope you will join us too. With that, thank you. That's all I had to say.